devoted time to looking at previous revolutions. In the French Revolution of 1789, people went on and on about the Roman Republic. In the Russian Revolution of 1917, people went on and on about the Paris Commune, about the French Revolution. Some of the parallels they drew were very unhelpful. The whole stupid debate about Thermidor that Trotsky got himself involved in was actually extraordinarily unhelpful. But nonetheless, it's the only terms in which we can look at the future, because it's all we have to go on. And of course, we live in a culture in which more and more universities are closing down their history departments. After all, you're not going to need a degree in history in order to teach the sort of syllabus that Michael Gove wants you to teach, you know. You just need a few journalistic cliches about how the working class liked flocking into the trenches in 1914. So I think that is the first crucial thing we have to say. We defend our history, and we defend above all that period after 1917, when the working class reached its highest level yet of organisation, of consciousness, of its ability to take over society. And of course the role of Lenin as an individual in that was extremely important. But if we're going to talk about Lenin's role, I think we have to start, not as most people have tended to do in recent discussions I've been involved in, with Lenin's theories of organisation, though I'll come back to those, but actually with Lenin's theory of the state. The most important thing Lenin ever wrote was State and Revolution. And if you only ever read one book by Lenin in your life, read State and Revolution, because State and Revolution actually talks about the nature of the revolutionary process. It makes the absolutely fundamental point that socialists can't achieve any worthwhile transformation of society simply by taking over the existing institutions, but that those institutions actually have to be smashed and replaced. And of course it also, quite fundamentally, undermines the whole idea that socialism is something to do with state control, with state ownership. And of course that's the myth which is propagated by the enemies of socialism, and which is often colluded in by people who are supporters of socialism. Socialism is not defined in terms of state control and ownership. And I think Lenin quite fundamentally undermines that notion in State and Revolution. So the greatness of Lenin starts there. But of course also, I think as has been quite correctly argued by a whole number of people, Lenin believed very firmly in the necessity for revolutionary organisation. His entire life was devoted to building an organisation. But at the same time, I think we have to get rid of the whole myth of the so-called Leninist party. There was no such thing as the Leninist party. There were, on a rough count, at least 7 and perhaps more different models of party organisation, radically distinct from each other, that you can trace between 1900 and 1922, on the basis of what was going on. And I want to quote from Tony Cliff, because I think actually, although there are points on which one can criticise and disagree, I still stand by the account of Lenin which Tony Cliff gave in his massive biography of Lenin. And get my piece of paper the right way up. Another of Lenin's characteristics is an attitude to organisational forms as always historically determined. He never adopted abstract, dogmatic schemes of organisation and was ready to change the organisational structure of the party at every new development of the class struggle. Organisation, he was convinced, should be subordinated to politics. So, arguing that some particular organisational structure is Leninist is actually, I think, contrary to history. Again, just another quote from Cliff, when he says, authority by quotation is nowhere less justified than in the case of Lenin. If he is cited on any tactical or organisational question, the concrete issues that the movement was facing at the time must be made absolutely clear. Whether Cliff always adhered to that principle in his own works is another matter, but that's not really our concern here. What conclusions can we draw? Lenin, as I say, was absolutely concerned with organisation, but he also always believed that organisation must be developed in the changing circumstances of the situation. And of course that isn't to say we write off everything Lenin wrote. There are some excellent things. You know, if you take What Is to Be Done, not as some sort of recipe book for the Leninist party at all times and places, as it all too often has been, by both its friends and its enemies, but if you take it as a book that contains many insights, actually the way Lenin talks about ideology, about the relation between political and economic struggle, about the role of a revolutionary newspaper and so on, there are enormous pieces of value there. But actually I think it's worth remembering Lenin's almost final appearance on this question. The Fourth Congress of the Comintern, when he was so ill, he had to actually be lifted onto the platform in order to speak. But he was aware that Zinoviev was actually already developing something which was going to be called Bolshevization. That is, trying to transform all the communist parties of Europe and elsewhere along the models of the Russian line. Lenin's speech, which was cheered to the echo, but I think not very much understood, actually says very clearly, the resolution is too Russian. It reflects Russian experience. That is why it is quite unintelligible to foreigners, and they cannot be content with hanging it in a corner like an icon and praying to it. And he goes on to say that actually he doesn't know what the best form of organisation is, but the comrades need to study. And so, basically, I would conclude with that. There is enormous amounts to be learned from a study of Lenin, but I think we have to get rid once and for all of this notion that there is something called Leninism.
Next we have Ezekiel Kramer, who's the SOAS Unison Assistant Brand Secretary. The cleaning workers at SOAS have been involved in an inspiring campaign around some really big vibrant picket lines over the last few weeks, and I'd like to invite Ezekiel to talk about that.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Well, Consuelo Moreno, one of the cleaners and leader of the campaign, is supposed to come over here and talk, but for personal matters she couldn't attend, so that's why you're having me instead, so bear with me, please. Well, I'm here as a representative of the cleaners talking on behalf of them. But important on the campaign, I'm going to have a bit of history of the campaign so everyone understands what's going on at SOAS. The Justice for Cleaner campaign started in 2006. It happened after the cleaners were shipped over from one company to another one, and the new company didn't pay them the salary for 3 months. So that's when the brand secretary stepped in, and then he managed to resolve the problem in a matter of 2 weeks. And this actually encouraged the cleaners to see, okay, there's something can be done if we actually organize each other. So there's also someone there listening to us. And this is particularly important of the movement. The movement is precisely a workers-led campaign. Are the cleaners over there organizing and unison actually helping them and contributing with the development? But it's the cleaners themselves who take the decisions. Despite the fact that despite this, they also need support. And this support needs solidarity for everybody in here and beyond these doors. And that's why, when that happened in 2006, the cleaners thought we can organize and we can do something. And that led to, in 2008, they won the London living wage and the union recognition. It took them 2 years. It's not something easy. to fight for. Also, you're fighting against ISS. It's a massive multinational corporation with 520,000 employees worldwide, 47,000 employees in only the UK, and a profit of 48,000 millions on profits. So we are fighting against a giant. But the cleaners are a giant nowadays, so they want to walk through him. And I'm pretty sure about that. So the cleaners continue in 2008, and they say, okay, we want more. That's not enough. Yeah, we got a lot of living wage, but we need to continue. So they started to organize for dignity, respect, equal treatment, and equal terms and conditions at those working directly for the university, which is equal sick pay, holidays, and pensions. So the campaign started, but nevertheless, in 2011, the campaign shifted. And the cleaners actually realized that there's not enough. We shouldn't be asking just for that. We should ask it to be brought back in-house. We want to actually be part of SOAS and no longer be working for ISS. So everybody was looking and said, oh, what's going on in here? How the cleaners dare to come here to tell us that we want to end outsourcing, we want to fight against privatization. But they are doing so. And these campaigns actually have empowered many, many workers and across different universities. We have phone calls from a lot of cleaners in different universities, not only London, Manchester, Birmingham, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, they try to organize themselves and fighting against privatization and be asking to be brought in-house. Well, the cleaners continued. Then actually, they started the negotiation to go to take strike actions against ISS. The legal dispute is against ISS because they are the employer, but nevertheless, we also put pressure on SOAS regarding the oxymoron. The SOAS preach something that actually doesn't actually do in practice. Well, anyway, they went to strike after 3 fruitless negotiations. The cleaners have no option to go to strike. The first day when the ballots started, it was a Monday. The ISS, ISS UK director, he came down to SOAS at 6 o'clock in the morning to tell the cleaners, to advise them about the consequences of taking strike action. What he said was, if you go to strike and ISS lose the contract with SOAS, then the new company, you don't have any guarantee that the new company will actually pay the London living wage. And I said, no, wait a minute. This has nothing to do with the London living wage, where I said. The London living wage is an agreement between Unison and SOAS. It's not an agreement with ISS. So ISS is not here to determine whether the cleaner is going to get the London living wage. But nevertheless, the cleaners knew that. But the ISS wanted to scare them, wanted to intimidate them and say, take care, okay? Because we're going to replace them, because we got 47,000 employees in the UK. So you're going to be easy be replaced. So they use all these techniques to scare the workers. But it worked completely the opposite. The cleaners ended up this meeting really pissed off about what's happening. They said, you don't want to come in here to intimidate us. And that was the result of 100% of the cleaners who returned to the ballot boxes voted yes for a strike action. And that actually shows that they won't accept any intimidation here. They reflect how they actually organize and how they actually come forward and how they actually are determined to continue. So we went to strike on the 4th and 5th of March, and then we wanted to strike again on the 21st. And then we might go to strike again in 4 weeks' time and then we continue and continue and continue. Precisely because we are in the position that ISS say, look, we don't care about you, look, we're not going to give you nothing at all. And SOAS, as I said at the time, it's actually pretty weird. Because SOAS sent an emails and posted posters in the university, never happened before, saying, oh, this is not our dispute. SOAS is not part of the dispute, so don't take it on us. You need to deal with ISS. So we knocked the SOAS door and said, what's going on? This is not your dispute. Your dispute, well, actually, you hired ISS to provide the cleaning services because it's cheap. However, what is cheap is actually very expensive when it comes to human consequences. And that's why they extract the profit from the labor in order to make to propose a cheap contract for cleaning services. Anyway, apparently, SOAS manager, they don't attend any lectures at SOAS because they don't understand how this thing works. But one of the main keys in here I want to emphasize is how the cleaners have organized themselves. They are migrant workers. So everyone says, oh, the migrant workers, they are unable to organize because they are vulnerable. Yes, they are vulnerable. Yes, they are. Oh, they were. Not anymore. And apart from that, the language barriers. So they don't speak the language and sort of yes, they hold 3 jobs. It's really difficult to organize a workplace when you got people working for 4 till 6, 8 till 10, 11 to 12 in 3 different jobs. But you need to do the job. You need to go over there, you need to work, you need to actually contribute with them, you need to meet them, you need to make party, Latino party, whatever. Just have breakfast or whatever, and to encourage them, and to see them that they are there, that there are people listening to them. But despite that, they wanted this. They want change. And this is something that is invaluable. The people want and they believe that change is possible. Change is possible by fighting and trying to break the structure of the university and the structure of this system, the one is oppressing every single of us. And for this reason, they understood that joining forces with the lecturers, with the social staff, with the students, and the cleaners together, they can make a common front with the fraction as well, of course. And they can actually make a united front against the structure not just the structure of soil, but the structure of the capitalist system in itself. And the most important is these migrant workers who actually decided to organize. Everyone thought that we were vulnerable, everyone thought that they couldn't do it, they could do nothing. So I say, well, we don't care about them. They are invisible for us, we don't care. Well, if you go to the strike on the 4th and 5th, they were not invisible. There were hundreds and hundreds of people supporting them. And they showed that the migrant workers, they can organize. And this is a message also for the UKIP and conservative and where it's over there, it's talking rubbish. I said the cleaners are here organizing, they are migrant workers and they're here to stay. But they're here to stay and to fight and to change the structure of the system, the one that's actually being oppressing them. I said that's
And finally, we've got Jen Wilkinson, who's a teaching assistant in London and an RS21 member.
That was actually really good timing, because I don't know if you've seen, I was just finishing writing what I was going to say, just as he finished speaking. I actually wanted to start with a meeting that I saw Ian Birchall do at the East London branch of RS21 on Wednesday, where Ian argued that there were 3 reasons that he initially got involved with the Socialist Review Group however many years ago, which were having a political analysis that could make sense of the world, having a perspective for realistic activity and the type of organisation that the Socialist Review Group was. And it seems that those are the 3 things that we are trying to do as RS21, and we clearly don't have the answers to all of those 3 things, particularly in terms of questions around political analysis. But this weekend, I hope people have enjoyed and has been part of a process of trying to develop that analysis. We divided the weekend partly around 3 key themes, and I don't know if people have seen, we've sort of structured some of the discussions on the website around those themes as well, around the nature of the period, around questions of women's oppression, and around revolutionary organisation. And it's not because we see those as 3 separate and distinct areas, it's because we've identified those as three things that are important for us to start to get to grips with. I think that what we've been trying to do this weekend is to see them not as distinct categories, but as part of a totality. So one of the important things that Marxists try to do all the time is understand the relationships and the connections between all of these different areas, the relationship between social, economic and political. So the different sorts of discussions that we've had over this weekend have looked at the relationship between the global impoverishment of millions of people as a result of capitalist crisis and issues around rising levels of gendered violence, for example, or I can't remember what it's called, the speaker from Historical Materialism was talking about EU integration and globalisation and how we understand that this is linked to an analysis of the shape of the economic crisis, the way that the economic crisis is playing out across Europe and internationally. It's related to questions around racism as well. So she talked about how capital flows to less developed countries are related to patterns of migration, which are in turn related to changing patterns of racism that Bat was talking about in the last session today, around the changing, Bat will speak about this actually, around the way that the shift that's taking place from questions of Islamophobia to anti-immigration sentiment that's fueling the rise of an organisation like UKIP, or probably the topic that's in vogue at the moment is the debates around social reproduction how does the crisis in capitalist production have an impact on reproduction? How are the attacks on the welfare state forcing care for the young and the elderly and the disabled back into the home and disproportionately onto the backs of women? I'm not saying this just to kind of give a list of all the things that you feel incompetent because you don't know enough about all of these different areas. That's why we're all together in a room sharing people's different experiences and understanding. So I want to just, one of my favourite expressions is that Marxism is both a science and an art, and I want to explain why I like that. I think the commonality, the thing that brings us all together, is hopefully people here agree that Marx provided a framework for understanding the workings of capitalism, which is still relevant today. I talked about this a little bit as well. We all agree that on the internal contradictions of capitalism. We can all see class conflict very clearly at the moment. Lots of people have made the joke this weekend about how we're seeing high levels of class struggle at the moment. It's just unfortunate that it's class struggle coming entirely from, almost entirely from the ruling class. Hopefully we also all agree that the key to changing this is the overthrow of a capitalist system, and it is the power of the organised working class is the key to doing that. Problem is that's a common starting point, but that only gets you so far, and that's the bit about Marxism also being an art. Again, this is what Ian was just talking about. You can't just refer back to Marx, you can't just refer back to Capital to get answers at the moment about how do we challenge the rising levels of anti-immigration sentiment in Britain at the moment, for example. Like I say, in RS21, we haven't got all of the answers around this, we haven't got a well-developed perspective, but over the course of this weekend, I feel a lot clearer about some of the questions, at least, that we're trying to pose. The particular one, I think, is why has there been an inadequate response to austerity? Why has there been inadequate resistance to austerity capable of trying to push back the attacks? And I think part of the answer to that is the victory of neoliberalism and its reach politically, economically and socialism and socially has undermined working class organisation, which has undermined class confidence and our own ability to fight back effectively. And it seems to me that points to one of the ways that we have a perspective for realistic activity. One thing that we can all be part of doing, in whatever modest way, is attempting to rebuild the left, attempting to rebuild working class organisation, and whether that's in the workplace or in the community campaigns, whatever it is that your centre of activity is. And hopefully in the process of that will pose more clearly some of the issues and the practical tasks that we face. So that's one thing that we can be doing. But there's something else that I think is developing out of some of the discussions that is a bit more distinct about what we're trying to argue at the moment. Correct me if people think this is wrong. But the need to see the labour movement as something that extends beyond the workplace, that extends into the anti-cuts campaigns, into community campaigns, into housing campaigns, etc. So I want to sort of tentatively propose that one thing that we also ought to be thinking about is what we do around the People's Assembly demonstration in June, not because there's an argument that this is the next event that's going to be the springboard for a rising level of struggle, but because it is an important opportunity to try to bring together the people involved in all the different anti-cuts groups and campaigns and workplace struggles to try to involve new people. And it's also something we can use then to assess where do we think the anti-cuts movement is at in Britain, what do we think are the next steps that we need to do to be able to push that further forward. And then the final question then, that I said there were three things that Ian said attracted into the Socialist Review group, and the third one was around what type of organisation. I'm going to kind of dodge this a little bit by saying this is clearly a very big topic, and I don't want to try to throw out inadequate truisms around why we need to have a democratic organisation, because I don't have the time to interrogate what do we mean by democratic. But I hope over the process of the course of the weekend, people have enjoyed the openness and the genuine attempt to engage in debate and discussion and to collectively arrive at ideas. And I see that's part of how do we try to create a democratic culture that is capable of developing a perspective and realistic strategy for action.
Thanks to all the speakers. We've now got just about 25 minutes for contributions and questions. So if you indicate, I'll call you in. And then I'll bring in speakers at the end to sort of sum up for a couple of minutes. So,
I think it's not. Neoliberalism has beaten us down. It's beaten our communities down. It's beaten down even our sense of self, our understanding of what it is to be an alcoholic, an understanding of what it is to be depressed. They have colonized an enormous amount of our experience. And they have defeated our labor movement in all sorts of ways. But I think that makes us much weaker, and it makes us much angrier. And it does both.
And that's not only true of revolutionary socialists. It's true, I think, right through everybody I work with and almost everybody I know. This country is absolutely full of people who are desperate for somebody else to fight back and somebody else to lead a fight back that they can pile in after. And I think this is a global thing, and it produces a situation in which people are both absolutely beaten down and unwilling to do anything, and in which there are sudden and utterly unpredictable eruptions, in which there is both people putting up with everything, and suddenly there's the so-as cleaners. There is neoliberalism doing anything it absolutely wanted to people in Turkey, and suddenly a mass occupation in cities all over Turkey in order to defend some trees in Gezi Park. I've seen those trees. They're cracked trees. I like trees, but we have to deal with both of those things. And we have to think that the deep feeling of frustration that we have as revolutionary socialists about the prospect of changing the world, that deep yearning and feeling of frustration and anger and all those things, that doesn't make us different from everybody else. That's what everybody else I know and everybody I work with is going through as well. And that means we have to relate simultaneously to a movement that is very weakened and is unpredictably explosive. We have to have both sides of that contradiction in our mind the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very important discussion. I think that I remember recently being called not Leninist, which I was a bit shocked about because I didn't agree with the SWP leadership. So therefore, that means I'm not Leninist apparently, which was a bit of a surprise. But you live and you learn. But I agree with comrades when they're saying that neoliberalism has massively smashed our side. I think that you can't separate the problems in the SWP from the fact that it's a reflection of how much our side has suffered, that it has gone into crisis. But I think that it's very important that it's fantastic that we got a comrade who's talking about workers that are fighting here today, because it's very important that we don't therefore accelerate that decline and come to the argument that, oh well, the working class are not going to fight, or that they've been bought off in some way, because this is total rubbish, thankfully. But I understand how people can come to that conclusion. We've had so much long time of low level of struggle that there is a certain sense to that argument. But we have to look at how the political degeneration has affected. When you look at Martin Smith talking about the trade union leaders wanting to fight, it doesn't actually fit with reality. When they're saying, oh, they're not confident, they don't suffer the job losses, the threat to their homes, the cuts in conditions that working people do suffer. They have a stake in the system. So we have to realise that we do have to look to when people act independently, like the Sparks, where they acted independently of trade union leadership and actually had a fantastic victory against a major employer like Balfour Beat International Capitalism. So we have to realise that victory is not easy, but it is possible, and we have to get away from this idea that we look towards centrism, that we can reform the system. We can't win by getting people into trade union positions, though we may want that occasionally. We can't win by elections. We win by class struggle. That's what wins. Like the Sparks.
I think one of the things I think the purpose of this session is to think about kind of where we're at and where we want to go. And I think one of the things that we need to think about coming to terms with is how has neoliberalism changed the way that we see struggle might emerge. Because one of the conceptions that I think we were all guilty of, or an assumption, was kind of that struggle would re-emerge in the way that it emerged in the past, that there would be a gradual increase of strikes leading towards more generalised strike movement to allow the left to rebuild and start to get sort of networks in the way that the Communist Party did or the struggles in the 70s developed. I think we've been very slow to come to terms with actually how has class struggle developed in practice. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Spain, if you look at Turkey, the mass struggles that have emerged precisely outside of traditional social democratic forms, even of having quite a formal social democratic politic, have real lessons to learn for us. I think one of the things that we need to think about doing as RS21 now is think about where can we start to root ourselves as individuals in a way that allows us to start to talk and have a discussion with people that are inspired by those sort of struggles. And I think we, in our localities, have had a good process of starting to think through some of the broader lessons. I mean, Colin Barker put it really well, I think, a couple of weeks back when he said revolutionaries asked themselves two questions. He said Marvin Gaye asked what's going on, and Lenin asked what is to be done. And I think we've had a lot of discussing about what's going on around the world, and we need to start thinking in a much more concrete way over the next couple of months about how do we draw that down to a local level and think about what that means as a revolutionary, where you are, where we're trying to get active, and precisely what sort of method are we bringing to those struggles that relates the way we're doing activity now to the sort of struggles that we think could transform society in the future.
The next is Hilary and then
Hi. I wanted to talk about, well, kind of following on from what Rob was saying, which is about taking people through the process, how we root ourselves locally. Where we are, we've been involved in the Justice for Mark campaign, and we've seen, a very sensitive campaign, and Carol Duggan kind of at the head of it. And when we're talking about generalising as revolutionaries and participating in these campaigns, we've actually seen Carol go from someone who was kind of, and the family, involved in that campaign to now leafleting and involved in a housing campaign in the Broadwater Farm Estate, where we have local agitation and local activity going on a weekly basis, organised by the residents with Carol leading it. And I think this is really important because we're seeing people going through a process of being, angry, perhaps with the system, with the police, and the racist way in which her nephew was killed, to now becoming like a class fighter. And being able to kind of get involved in other things. And I think this is really, really important. Also, with regards to what Ian was saying, I think we spoke about this in the last meeting, what Paul LeBlanc calls Leninism in the 21st century, I mean, to me, that's very important because I think where we've come from is more of a program of a dogmatic 1, 2, 3. These are the steps. This is what works. This is what's always worked, and this is how we need to organise. And I think now we're looking at different methods, and that could be organising meetings flexibly and thinking about the kind of people we have around us, and getting others to organise themselves, which is actually quite a radical process rather than us just going up onto the platform and kind of not trusting others. And I think this is an important process for us. Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I really want to follow up from what Jonathan said and what was said over there, because and just connect with one of the things that Berkshire was talking about at the meeting I was at. One of the theorisations that Socialist Review IS developed was something called the changing locus of reform, which argued that it remained true that the first step for a lot of workers and a lot of other people into challenging the system is to look to join organisations which are trying to reform it. And the particular theorisation, which was probably over-exaggerated, was that the space where workers were looking to get reforms had moved away from Parliament and official trade unions to shop stewards and local activities. So I think, and I think that is very important. And I think the point that's being made is that we need to be looking, not to create a great theorisation at this point, because we can't. What we can do is try to find the ways and the spaces in which people are doing that. And one of the things that may lead us to have to do a bit is to drop a way of argument that the front pages of a lot of left papers continue to use, which is the assumption that the people we're speaking to out there are people who are already some sort of socialists, but want more, harder, better socialism. If the case is that people are thinking of things in slightly different ways, who aren't yet grasping that socialism doesn't mean a bunch of boring bureaucrats running the place, but actually means people taking things for themselves, and are not quite sure, then those sorts of slogans aren't necessarily the ones we should be putting up. I'm just saying that as something for us to think about, not abandoning what we stand for, but rethinking the way we write it down, so we don't assume that the people we're giving our leaflets to already have things in their heads, which they may not have in the same shape they used to.
I'm Martin Thomas from Workers' Liberty. Very briefly, I want to argue for a general approach and say what it might be. The general approach, which has been mentioned by some RS21 speakers this weekend, is on the left, you go for unity in action where you agree, where you disagree, you debate things out honestly and democratically. And what I want to suggest is, firstly, there are some areas where our groups could work together. There's some trade unions, there is work we can do together among students. There's one particular thing we could do together, which is some activity against the moves to ban the SWP on campuses, which are going on now. I don't want to exaggerate these, but they do exist. They exist on politicised campuses. There is very little vocal opposition to it at the moment. The main mover in the ban at ULU has just been elected, won the election for NUS Women's Officer, will be in that position for the next year. It's not something that's just a matter of this week or next week. So I just ask you to think about whether we can collaborate on some level on those issues, and then whether we can debate some issues. I just want to, there's been some talk today about different patterns of racism, about racism which is now directed against East European migrant workers here. And I want you to think in that context about the position you've inherited from the SWP of being in favour of the Britain leaving the EU, which, as a speaker pointed out earlier today, means to all those workers, go home, and whether you should continue with that position. And you need to decide that pretty smartly before May, where it's going to be a very big political issue.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our role as revolutionaries organising today around questions of oppression, as you probably expect me to speak about. So you know, since the sort of rise of neoliberalism, and Nancy Fraser speaks about this. She speaks about the way in which neoliberalism has sort of co-opted feminism and co-opted feminist language. And for its own projects, and you can see this both in the way, you know, this notion of women liberating themselves is now meant to be about, you know, it is inherently connected to consumerism. So you're liberated if you buy, I don't know, X sex toy or X dress, or you know, etc., etc. But also the way in which women's bodies and the image of women's bodies are bought and sold as products in the market. So there's this hypersexualization of women's bodies that's going on, and in conjunction with this, there's also an there's the individualization of oppression. So you know, no longer the sort of the very helpful way in which oppression was understood, you know, in the civil rights movement, in the women's liberation movement, in the gay liberation movement, as structural. You know, given the rise of sort of quite individualist ideology following neoliberalism, there's this notion that you're oppressed if you choose to be offended by something, or you're oppressed if you, you know, choose to do things in specific ways. So you can see this in, for example, the way people address the question of sexual assault. You know, if you choose to wear a dress, if you choose to go out late at night, then it's your fault for being oppressed. So that's the sort of context that we're in. However, I think it's also important to speak about the context of resistance that we've seen, you know, over the past 5-10 years, and there's an emerging understanding of the structural way in which oppression works, specifically with regards to sexism. Even in the last 3 years, I think you can see this much more clearly. Steubenville, for example, the unfortunate case of a woman who was passed out and videotaped being dragged across the room, and she was sexually abused by 2 young men. The protests after that were outside police stations, and there were protests against the way in which the police dealt with the case. If you look at India and what happened with the young woman who was raped and assaulted on a bus, again, Parliament spread throughout the global south against Parliament. If you look at even little things like No More Page 3, which are No More Page 3, which are, you know, it's resistance against media, you know, resistance against lab culture. Again, it's a resistance against a culture, not individual groups of people. So I think we also need to think about how we take advantage of this, you know, re-emerging understanding of sexism as structural and our role as revolutionaries within these pockets of resistance.
In terms of the what is to be done question, one of the basic kind of issues that faces the working class and humanity is obviously climate chaos, and I think it's incredibly important the fact that, you know, the next planned national meeting we have is on eco-socialism. I think we need to see this as something that goes through all the different things we're doing, and I think we should be thinking about the ways in which we can make things. I mean, Rob mentioned Brazil. One of the surprising kind of explosions there was that it was about a movement for free passes. We should think about the ways in which movements for free transport are being brought into the issues about climate. And I think we see with the flooding again. I think we should think about the ways in which we can make that link. It created a very serious kind of a relatively serious kind of political crisis for the Tory party. I think we're going to see more. We're going to see more of these kind of floods. So I think we should be thinking ahead about what we can do around that. So I would like us. One of the things we do is bring climate, and then obviously there is a movement that is building over fracking, and I think we need to be putting ourselves right at the centre of that.
We might not have time for everyone that's indicated. I think it's a positive thing that does feel like to contribute. So please don't be offended if that's something that I'll do my best. If you can keep them in contact. So Nathan, or like. Next to next.
So yeah, I mean, RS21 obviously, as Phil already can't stand up and declare itself here the Revolutionary Party, but and so I mean, it remains to be seen how useful the theoretical discussion is. But what I found inspiring about this weekend is that we've had a culture of openness, in which we're not just we're not saying let's get rid of the left and smash all the old ways of organising. We do recognise that there's a lot of good parts of tradition to be saved, but also that in a lot of places our methods haven't worked. And they're looking, they're having to rethink, they're reevaluating that, and that's been really good. And apologies to those that have already heard about me banging on about this in the pub last night, but one of the bits I found most interesting is this discussion of social reproduction theory and how that idea can help us in practice. I mean, where are some of the front lines of austerity today? It's the people who have been displaced out of their homes by gentrification, by housing benefit cuts, forced into sort of a programme that's beginning to accelerate into what looks like social cleansing, into abandoned towns in the middle of nowhere. You've got the hideous response to the flooding, also forcing people from their homes. You've got queues outside courts because even the law enforcement system cannot handle the sheer amount of people who can't afford to live. You've got more queues of people, the 1.3 million people that are reliant on food banks, and that's where I think at least the left should be. And within that, the discussion about liberation is important because, of course, a lot of these experiences are gendered, are racialised. From the discussion we had before about the impact of austerity on gendered violence, the fact that over in Southall there was a case, of course, in the Evening Standard quite recently of 50 migrant workers living in skips and bins on the council estate somewhere. So I think there really is a genuine argument for taking the tactics of the workplace, the methods of building union branches, building industrial struggle, and generalising them into a totality of more social forms of unionism.
After Ruth is Matt.
I kind of wanted to follow on from what Jen was saying about what we were trying to do with this weekend, and it's great that people have got a lot out of it. That's reassuring. But I think we need to make sure that the processes that we've begun in the last couple of months and tried to bring out today continue. So one of the key things that I think we're all trying to do is rectify the problem that we had in previous organisations of not really getting to grips with the period that we're in. And I think that people are starting to get their heads around that. We've heard things like what Jonathan Neal was saying about that, we're in a really unpredictable situation where there can be sudden explosions, but at the same time there's this general sense of weakness and defeat. I think that's really key to the situation we're in. And another thing is that the fights that we are seeing breaking out are incredibly ideological because the attacks that we're facing are incredibly ideological. Austerity it reaches into every aspect of our lives and of how society is structured, and so people recognise that and they're acknowledging that when they're fighting back, and it lends itself to a critique of the whole system rather than just of that one little aspect of it, which I think provides us with opportunities. And the other thing I think we haven't talked about that much this weekend, but certainly has been a feature that recently that people have been discussing, is it's incredibly international. Like I think Estelle was saying something about the way that anti-capitalist struggles aren't so internationally linked up in terms of organisation, but in terms of the inspiration that's sort of crossing national boundaries, from the Arab Spring through to the struggle in Bosnia. You're seeing replications of methods of popular assemblies and all this sorts of thing. And I think that's incredibly inspiring and something that we should get our heads around, especially when comrades are talking about the issue of the EU and immigration and all of these things. I think they are going to become massive, potentially fault lines. So I think that's one thing that we are starting to get our heads around. And the second thing is coming up with perspectives and strategies for action, which I think is something that logically will follow on from this weekend, hopefully. I think one of the things we need to make sure that we do is try and capture some of the debates that have come up in the sessions, try and get people who've come here, if you're a member of RS21 or if you're not, but if you found something interesting or if you've come across a point of view that you want to explore, I think we would want to encourage people to take part in those debates on our website or on our Facebook page or whatever, and just get more people taking part in those discussions, but deepening them and hopefully leading to conclusions about what we're going to do together, hopefully.
Right. So just sort of some random thoughts, and it was kind of sparked by, I think it was what Jenny said about we need to recognise that class struggle takes place outside of the workplace. Of course it does. But I think we also need to, we had a session yesterday about sort of how neoliberalism has changed the working class and working class organisations. But I think we also need to look at how it's changed the campaigns and the movements that we're a part of. Like, my impression is that, say, the People's Assembly is very different from, for example, like the poll tax unions or the campaigns around the miners' strike. Like, in my experience, which is very narrow, and it's important not to generalise, but the People's Assembly and Left Unity, like the leadership and to an extent the sort of the activists have been, well, very middle class. I think looking at the working class today, most workers are in the private sector. Most workers are unorganised with no history of organisation. There's the big battalions of the class, as it were, in the public sector. Post the pensions dispute are sort of, well, frankly, seem defeated and demoralised, at least for the extent of the life of this government. The workplace is where neoliberalism is felt most acutely, I feel. And like, as we've seen with the KUK strikers in Doncaster, the cleaners disputes, like organisation and sort of socialist ideas and principles can have very rapid traction amongst groups of workers previously thought to be unorganisable. Workers will join unions and movements when they feel that they have agency in them and that those unions and movements can change the conditions of their life. I think we need to be involved in the movement, but be conscious at all times as to how we can build confidence and organisation at work, in the workplace, and relate that directly into the embryonic movements and help workers and working class politics assume leadership in them. Like, I think we have to be a lot sharper on how we as socialists, basically train ourselves and organise ourselves at work, and how then we can relate that to the movements and help give them a boost.
So this one here, then Estelle will be our final contributor. Thank you for the husband. Sorry for the work.
I agree with Ian in saying that we should not fetishize something called Leninism, and in fact I think in a number of parties calling themselves Trotskyists, Leninism has actually been practice Stalinism and Stalinist method. However, I think there are some basic principles, in terms of the necessity of building a leadership in the working class that we should not lose sight of. Someone mentioned Lenin asking the right question when he said what is to be done, and a long time before that, Karl Marx put it in a very similar way. The philosophers have interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. And I think this is something that is very important. The revolution of the working class is something that has to be consciously changing society. There's a big subjective factor. It's not something that just happens. because capitalism happens to be a particular type of system that will then automatically, by some kind of mechanical process, give way to something else. The comrade representing the cleaners, I think, is very importantly said that in this struggle, they come to realise the need to struggle against to change the system. I think it's very important. Obviously, the organisation, the workers' struggle, the consciousness, awareness of their role as a revolutionary class greatly increases. But this does not mean that there is no need for communists in the working class. Again, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto said the communists are distinguished from the rest of the class because they know the line of the march, while also emphasising they have no separate interest from the class as a whole. And I think it is important to keep to these principles. After all, bourgeois ideology does dominate society. Communists do have to help workers to struggle against it and to learn from the experience of strike action and so on to develop a revolutionary consciousness. Of all the revolutionary situations that Ian mentioned, really, it was only 1917 that actually the working class took power from. And I think it's important to see that. That's even though the Soviets...
Stop.
Yeah, I just want to come back on and kind of correct something that I think we've said a lot of this weekend, and that I think unless we kind of say it, it's a problem, so I'm going to say it. People have talked a lot about neoliberalism making uprisings quite fragile and being very sporadic and spontaneous and all these different things, and that is partly because the system is in crisis and the system is fragile, and the system is doing all kinds of sporadic, spontaneous things. The ruling class haven't got a clue what they're doing and don't have a strategy. I think also one of the interesting features of the crisis is that we live in a world where actually the symbolism of events gives them an important way, out of proportion from the numbers involved. So look at Seattle, look at Occupy. Actually, you don't have huge numbers of people involved in those things, but because people are grasping for anything, any kind of resistance, they acquire this massive symbolism. At the same time, I think we can let ourselves off the hook a little bit, because I've done this all weekend as well. We talk about these unpredictable uprisings, we talk about sporadic, spontaneous things, blah, blah, blah. Actually, behind every single one of these uprisings has been a process of development and a process of radicalisation and whatever. And so we do have to, part of working out our analysis is going to be developing, predicting where these things are going to happen. And when you read Lenin, you get this idea, you get this sense that he knows what is going on in every single part of the Russian Empire, in every single, from Moscow to this, village, right on the other side of Russia. And we're going to have get a bit of a sense of that, I think, if we're going to do well. The other things I think it's fascinating to have the Ezekiel speak from the cleaners today. To just think about where do we see most resistance in the world and most potential for resistance today. Some people would say Latin America. 20 years ago, where was the testing lab, the laboratory for neoliberalism? It was Latin America, and so clearly it's not the case that neoliberalism quashes resistance in that way. It does cause this kind of I'll finish on this. I think we're going to have to be really bold at times. I think we have to be prepared to make mistakes. I think we have to be, and that's difficult when you have all kinds of quite unconfident, oppressed groups and whatever. People are going to have to get into the habit of making mistakes and making mistakes being an okay thing to do. One of my favourite quotes is that quote that Lenin said about Rosa Luxemburg, where he said, "Eagles may at times fly lower than hens, but hens can never fly as high as eagles." And he was talking about all the mistakes she made in her life to do with political strategy, but that can apply to political parties as well. Actually, we might make big mistakes, but if we get big things right as well, that is better than just kind of trundling along, getting some things right a bit at a time. Just before I bring the speakers back in to sum up, there's a few announcements. Firstly, about our next public event that we're holding, which is a day school on eco-socialism, fracking, climate and revolution, which is happening on the 7th of June at SOAS. Jonathan has lots of flyers for people to take away, so I encourage people to come along to that. We're also going to be hosting a day schools on organising in the workplace. We haven't decided the dates yet, but in London and Manchester, and I would encourage people to come along to those. Also, in the near future, in May, we're going to be launching a publication, so we'd encourage people to send in their ideas for about that. We also have the RS21 website, which is up on the big screen, which we try to update every day. So I'd encourage you to keep checking back for sort of new comment. We also try and experiment with different forms of things. So we've had some quite good videos, which have had, I think, over 5,000 hits on YouTube, which I think shows that we're sort of doing something that people wanted to see anyway. I would really encourage people to continue the debates and discussions from this weekend. I'd encourage people to send in pieces that they have ideas about or drafts of and things like that, both from within RS21 and from outside, so we can continue some of the debates and discussion that's been happening. So I'll bring Ian in first, and Ezekiel, and then Jane. 2 minutes.
Fine. Comrades, 51 years ago, I joined an organisation that had 106 members. Today, I am speaking to an organisation of roughly the same size. Now, it'd be very easy to feel that this has been, to quote the language of one of our former comrades, 51 years for the locust. But actually, I want to point out something else, that there are actually 3 of us in this room who were at that meeting when I joined in 1962. And what that testifies to, I think, is the fantastic power of ideas. That it was the power of Marxist ideas, of Marxist analysis, that has kept 3 of us in our different ways active in socialist politics. And I think that is an important lesson. We can't determine the rhythm of class struggle. We can't determine when there will be a big upheaval like 1968 or when there will be a downturn. What we can determine, or what we can help to determine, is the fact that there will be socialists, that there will be people who are inspired by a Marxism that is critical, that is open, but that actually has the power of analysing what is wrong. And there's an awful lot wrong with the world we live in.
Okay, just very shortly. Yeah, I do believe that for us, I'm a self migrant worker as well, and I think for us it's really important to challenge this structure. We learned from South America. I left Argentina in 2001 after the economic crisis, and most of the cleaners did the same in their different countries. So I do believe that actually the consequence of neoliberalism actually got us being active, and we thought that happened in Spain as well, where a lot of different social movements started to emerge a bit late, but anyway, better late than never. But yeah, and I think so. It's one of the best, and one of the most important things is solidarity amongst us, is connections. For example, we work a lot with South American community as well, with other organizations. I think that the key to succeed, and the key to succeed is solidarity amongst us. And for that, I would like to ask all of you to come to our picket line, please. We will take place at the end of this month. It's really important numbers. Numbers show that we are united, and it's only by being united that we can create the change that we want. Thank you.
I'll just be really quick because I thought there were 2 important points that came out from the discussion. The first is the stuff that various people said, but Jonathan said it first, around keeping sight of the potential that exists, because we can end up becoming overly focused on the negative aspect of the picture, and there's an incredibly exciting things that are happening at the moment, which we need to make sure we keep sight of. We talk about how history weighs negatively against us in the terms of weak organisation, but there has been a sediment that has been left behind by the struggles in the 80s. Take the example of the struggle for women's liberation. Women might be being disproportionately impacted on by the cuts at the moment, but that's not going to be an easy battle to push women back into the home when there's an expectation amongst the vast majority of people that gender justice is something that is important and worth fighting for, and having a sense of those contradictions, I think, is important if we're going to 1, keep motivated, and 2, make sure that we're in positions to take advantage of the potential. And then the other thing is the point that Estelle made. I kind of did a bit of a sort of fluffy introduction in a lot of ways, and we can keep saying that we need to begin to develop a perspective, and we need to develop an analysis, and we need to get a sense of what the key tasks are. But unless we actually do that, we can't sit in rooms saying we need a perspective for the next 12 months. We're going to actually have to start doing that. This is part of a process, but there are questions about how we can try to improve what has happened here today and what we try to take back from that. And Amy asked me to raise this quickly, but if people are members and aren't paying us money at the moment, please pay us some money, because it really helps to try to do this. And we do have joining forms and stuff, so if you aren't a member, we're asking people to get involved, whether you want to be a member or not a member, at least be involved in the process of trying to develop the ideas that socialists are going to need to be able to act effectively in the coming period. Thank
you. Amy, before you start the course of organising,